It's wonderful to be here on Combermary country and acknowledging, especially given the title of our presentation, all the grannies, mothers, sisters and girls and all the elders and First Nations people here today and online, wherever you are, whatever country. I feel so lucky to be here. We feel so lucky to be here, and thank you for sharing this place with us. So today our presentation is about entwining women and the Great Barrier Reef, stories of past, prospects for the future, and I'm joined by my co-researcher Deb Anderson, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because of illness, but is online, and also very fortunate to have here one of our Women of the Reef, Alison Rickert. The Women of the Great Barrier Reef Project is a research collaboration that is discovering the untold stories of Australian women who have led the care and conservation of the reef since the 1960s. In recording and unpacking women's stories, which will be stored in perpetuity with the State Library of Queensland, a new story of the reef has begun to emerge, including and beyond the usual stories of science, industry and party politics. The reef becomes a site of gender politics, of women's lives and bodies, of strength and violence, challenge and opportunity, of equity and justice. This session speaks to how and why we find such extraordinary potential in women's stories of courage, creativity and cooperation to ignite more inclusive reef futures for all. We bring issues surrounding gender equity and justice to our thinking as a blind spot, at best, in serious official deliberations about the GBR policy and practice, and so therefore a certain source of disruptive and transformative thinking. Let me begin by introducing you to our wonderful Woman of the Reef and my friend Alison Rickert. So in the early 1970s, Alison arrived on One Tree Island as a young woman and began with her then partner to build the station facilities and to participate in research projects. The story of the buildings that are there now, 50 years later, can be told through the life of our Ally. Here we bring her story from the margins to the centre, and those of the many women who have already shared their stories as part of the Women of the Reef project, to consider women's role in the past and the future of the reef. Cradled by Ally's experience and her insight, now and then, we explore the meaning and potential of women's stories of the reef to retell the past, illuminate the present, and critically reimagine the future. We'll begin with the arrival and falling in love with the reef. One of our frequent conversations is often about whether women experience the reef differently to men, and this has been recurrent in our interviews. It often begins with conversations about relationships and relationality, of love and feeling, and all those emotions that are rightly or wrongly associated with women and often hold so very little power in guiding formal efforts to care for the reef. It harks back to those nature-nurture debates where we acknowledge our distinctive biology but we're not determined by it, where we interrogate how the feminine and female, the natural and nurtured, translates into the way we communicate about the reef, and therefore which knowledges, which positions hold power and authority, and with what consequences. Deadly photo of Alison there. So Alison, let's begin with a question for you. How did you come to be at the reef?
Well, I was studying biology at ANU, and in the library I saw these amazing first photographs by Saville Kent, the black and white photographs, and it was sort of like a deja vu, almost premonition feeling, I'm going to end up on the reef. And as I went into my honours year, I was invited to go and work on turtle research up at Heron Island for one of the members of the department, and I did that again on the second year. So I was already definitely falling in love with the reef.
Ali, can you share the experience of what it felt like to fall in love with the reef, this special place? How did you see it and how did that feel?
So I think, and this will probably be an experience many of you've had, I've going into another world. Of the first time I dived and went underwater, it was so extraordinary, and I think awe is the only word that does justice to it. And it wasn't just the profusion of life, it was the sense of being suspended in the water, the different colour, the different sounds. And it really felt like the Garden of Eden, because everything was just going about its business. It didn't notice me at all. And this was before humans had a chance to really mess with things.
And while you were falling in love with the reef, another relationship began, which eventually led you to One Tree Island.
Yes, so as intriguing and as full of adventure, there was a man on the reef, and you can just picture the scene, 22-year-old, impressionable, young, all this romance in the air. So it wasn't unsurprising that we fell in love. But there were some doubts in the back of my mind about, would this really last the distance? And did I listen to them? Of course not.
And then what led you to One Tree Island?
So while I was on Heron Island, I made contact with people from the Australian Museum who were making yearly migrations to One Tree Island to do their research. And One Tree is very isolated, very difficult to get to, and so it was reasonably untouched, and so it was the perfect place for them to make their collections, but they wanted a permanent presence there. So they asked us if we would go and set up a field station. I mean, how could you refuse an invitation to go and live on an uninhabited island?
The experience, and this is a part of Alison's story where work and motherhood begin to play a part in her relationship with the reef, where the feminist adage that the personal is political is easy to spot, the private lives of women and their bodies, and the public politics that marginalises women, and all the intersections of race, sexuality, socio-economic class, religion and so on that impact upon women's experiences. But salient is that the personal is really political, and failure to consider these moments of equity as they relate to the Great Barrier Reef impoverishes us all across all genders. So this section is about working on the reef as a woman, and later as a woman with a child, and highlighting the supports are not available, and drawing attention to the different kinds of science, the social science that Alison was interested in.
So describing what it was like to go to this uninhabited island, and of course you have lots of romantic notions, and there were many moments when we thought we'd bitten off more than we could chew, because One Tree isn't the idyllic sand cay that probably most of you associate with the reef. It's actually a rubble island on the very exposed end of the reef. So to kind of just encapsulate what it was like, because I've only got a short time, our very first landing happened in very rough weather, and so we were able to come in successfully with water and a tent. And when Steve went out to get our food, it was impossible. He couldn't get back on the boat, so we had our first meal was nothing. And I remember going and having a big cry on the sand rubble spit and thinking, how am I going to survive this time? But in a strange way, all the hardships that we went through together, which were weather-related and impossible projects, built a very strong bond, and it was an island that really stole my heart.
Ali, can you offer us examples of the kinds of research you were engaged with on One Tree?
So one of the things that I had to do was take water samples day and night, every half an hour. And so the night experience entailed taking my boat, a couple of miles down the reef and anchoring it, spending the whole night there, taking water samples. This picture you see, by then it was automated, but when I first started I had to do the whole lot just in bottles and do the stuff back in the lab. But it was an amazing thing to be out there in the night because we're so dominated by our visual senses, and to be somewhere where we could actually feel the vastness of the universe, the vastness of the reef, was really spellbinding.
And this extraordinary project involving a lot of Besser blocks, Ali?
This was the nightmare of our whole experience on One Tree Island. And I felt ambivalent about it right from the start, partly because it was the logistic nightmare to get 40 tonnes of Besser blocks out onto the reef and build them into artificial reefs, and partly because it just seemed such a travesty to bring all these ugly bricks and dump them onto the reef, even though in some senses it provided the clean slate to see how animals colonise those, barren spaces. In the course of 40 years, the history of what they were for got lost. And when I went back, the Besser blocks had taken over the island and they were under the tank stands, under chairs, under buildings. So they'd sort of gone to their rightful destination.
And so that's what happened to the blocks over time, didn't they? They lost track, and you were able...
Yes, and during the course of trying to build these really annoying reefs, they were knocked down by a cyclone, so we had to do it twice. So I personally turned 10 tonnes of Besser blocks into a reef on 2 occasions.
And here's your next phase. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this photo and quote, Alison?
So the Australian Museum really wanted to have a look at the northern Great Barrier Reef to see how it was different from the southern area, and they were able to get an opportunity to set up a field station on Lizard Island, so that was our next destination, to do it all over again from scratch. And by that stage I was pregnant, and so I brought Arwen, my baby Arwen, out to the island, and she lived with us in a tent from 10 weeks on. And it was a gorgeous place to have a baby, absolutely gorgeous. Nobody to give you advice, and nature everywhere. But sadly, Steve didn't take too well to being a parent, and so after about 14 months, I decided that it was better if I left. And that's when it really got tricky.
Tell us about what happened when you left the reef.
So after a short time, I really realised I wanted to pick up my career again, and I moved to Canberra, and Gabrumpa was in its very first year. And the new director, Don McMichael, knew me from the reef. He was part of the Australian Museum, and I had the best experience as a single parent you could have. And he said to me, well, you tell us what you think we should do and we'll give you all the support to do it. And because I'd lived intimately with the reef, I really thought that it was important to involve the people who lived locally, who used the reef, who knew it as well as I did, if not better. And so I proposed that I should do this project where I interviewed, it was a sort of early social science project, interview all the people who were living on the reef and find out what they thought, the places they loved, how it could be best cared for. What I underestimated was what it would be like to do that with a 2-year-old child. So I travelled with my best friend and her 2 kids and did the interviews, but then it took me a really long time to process. It was pre-computer days. And the middle manager gave me the worst experience of my life by calling me in when I hadn't finished and saying, why shouldn't I sack you? And I hope that, I don't imagine that would happen now. I hope it never does happen to any of you. But in those days, we didn't have that sense of, pushback. So I just said, oh, I'm really, really sorry. I'll do it in my own time. I don't expect to be paid, which is what I did.
So this is the establishment of the marine park, if you're keeping up with the time stamp here. And it's also at a time when single mothers didn't have access to the sorts of supports that they certainly do now. In the early 90s, Australian ecological feminist and philosopher Val Plumwood, in her seminal critique of the way nature has been thought in Western patriarchal culture, the book was called Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, underscored the power of storytelling. If we are to survive into a livable future, we must take into our own hands the power to create, restore and explore different stories with new main characters, better plots and at least the possibility of some happy endings. What is happening to the reef and what is happening to Australian women then and now is the same thing. Tides can be turned for both in the powerful act of storytelling. Ali's is a beautiful oral history that, looking back years later, sheds light on the reef as a gendered space with a gendered history. Her story speaks to a reimagining of the reef's future, one that recognises and addresses inequities and injustices, not only in terms of participation in the reef space, but also those already marginalised and impacted by the current state of the reef. So we've travelled together to One Tree Island last May, and you've returned more than once over the years. What does it reveal to you going back, Ali?
Well, it's definitely my heart place, and so it's always very emotional to go back. And this is where I think our response as humans is so important. What we feel is equally as important as what we do. And so it was always, this last one was particularly bittersweet because, I mean, I was 76 last year, and there was that thought I might not be able to come back again. There was the joy at finding it virtually untouched from the time when I had been there, and that's thanks to the high level of protection it's had. But there was also this deep sadness about the thought of the coral bleaching events that were going to come and destroy my heart place.
And that crossing over from Heron to One Tree?
It's always filled with joyful anticipation, and I remember making a crossing when I lived there. We used to do it at night quite often, where we actually couldn't see the island, but we could actually smell it, the smell of the vegetation, and hear the crickets singing as we arrived before we could see it. So there's always magic, and we went back in the night on that particular return to One Tree.
Sure was a special night. And yet you shared with us that you felt like an imposter now on that trip. Can you explain why?
I don't know. I sort of had this sense I wasn't a real scientist because I'd had an aborted career, and I then went into the field of psychology. But when I was back there, I always thought the human dimension was missing. And how do you engage with people so that they can learn to love these places, these wild creatures that don't have a voice of their own, so that they have an inner motivation to look after it. And that imposter thing was, you know, I sort of almost felt I couldn't go back to One Tree. I really was taking up space. But when I went back and saw what had followed on from our early foundational steps, it was really gratifying to see how much wonderful research had been done, to see the women there working and having a much easier go of it than I did, and to see the love. There was a lot of beautiful graffiti on the walls of the hall at One Tree, and so they expressed another dimension, the emotional human dimension of what the reef meant to all those people, and I felt very grateful I'd helped to make that possible.
Skip over that slide, yeah, and we're just going to ask Ali about her relationship with the reef now.
So I wanted to say thank you to all you people who are doing such wonderful human-focused social science on the reef and putting humans back into that dimension, because we are the problem and we can also be the ones who have fixed it. But I really want to acknowledge that it's a difficult space to occupy. Because many of you have come to it from a place of love like me, a passion for your work, but there's also that sense of knowing too much, of feeling this impending crisis looming, and the fear that that engenders, and that also can make us feel we've got to work harder and more desperately to kind of turn it around, and so we run into that question of self-care. And so I wanted to talk more as a psychologist a little bit about the feelings of grief and how we can actually harness them to help us to do our better work rather than just be disabled by them. So when I heard about the severe bleaching at One Tree this year, I couldn't face going there to see my heart place destroyed. And I went through a tailspin of grief, and I had counselling, and I thought very deeply about what I was experiencing and how I could maybe turn this around. So I think love and sorrow are two sides of the same coin. And so the sorrow that we feel can, if we turn towards what breaks our heart, give us the courage and strength and purpose to bring our mother love, our fierce mother love, into the equation to help protect the places we love. When it comes to anger, and we have all those little voices in our head, why didn't they act quicker? They had the technology. We could have turned this around 20 years ago. That can be very corrosive if you sit with that anger. But my experience was that you can actually also use it as an energy that gives you the courage and strength to fight on. When it comes to fear, I always used to think the antidote to fear was hope, but I think hope is a very fickle thing, and your hopes can be dashed when things are not going so well. So I would say courage is a better orientation to this situation. When it comes to despair, and that's the slippery slide we have to be very aware of, because it can lead us into giving up or into burning out and trying to work too hard. So I feel that the secret of handling despair is to either work with other people to do something, or at least have a virtual sense of all those wonderful people that are out there trying to turn things around. It's a bit like an Olympic race, and there's times when you just have to take a break for your own self-care. If you could think of it as like a relay, it's handing on the baton to someone else, stepping out and having a rest. And so metaphorically speaking, I have my baton here, and I'm planning to hand it to Kerrie, because I can't run so fast and so far anymore. It wasn't in the rehearsal. And no, it wasn't. But it's well earned, and I trust Kerrie to carry my baton. But figuratively speaking, I'm giving it to you all, and I'll be cheering along the sidelines, because I believe in the African proverb which says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And Deb, if you're listening, I have one for you too.
Thank you everyone for listening, and can you join me in thanking Alison today?